They didn't plan to grow up faster. They weren't told they were mature for their age. They didn't even realize it was happening. It just did. And years later, many of them look back and wonder why they always felt older than their peers. Why responsibility came so naturally, and why adulthood never felt like a sudden transition, but more like a continuation. This is the psychology of why 70s kids grew up faster than almost any other generation. If you grew up in the 1970s, there was very little separation between childhood and adulthood. There was no emotional buffer. Children were exposed to adult realities early. Adult conversations, adult problems, adult expectations. You heard things you weren't supposed to fully understand yet. You saw stress, you saw arguments, you saw money problems, and no one stopped to explain it or soften the blow. That early exposure accelerated psychological development. Because when children are repeatedly placed in adult contexts, their minds adapt. They start thinking ahead. They start scanning for consequences. They start learning what really matters in the adult world. Growing up fast wasn't encouraged, it was required. Many 70s kids were given responsibility long before they were emotionally ready for it. Watching younger siblings, letting themselves in after school, handling chores that actually mattered. They learned to manage small but very real risks. Mistakes weren't just treated as learning moments, they were treated as real-life consequences. If something went wrong, it was your problem to solve. That teaches a child something powerful and dangerous at the same time. My actions have real outcomes. This accelerates maturity because children who experience real responsibility early don't get the luxury of an extended, carefree innocence. They learn to anticipate, to prepare, and to avoid mistakes, not because they want to, but because they have to. In the 1970s, emotional needs were rarely the priority. Of course, parents loved their children, but emotional attunement wasn't central to the parenting culture back then. You weren't constantly asked how you felt. You weren't encouraged to process your emotions out loud. You weren't always reassured when life felt overwhelming. Instead, the message was subtle but consistent. Feelings come second. Function comes first. This taught children to regulate themselves prematurely. They learned to push feelings aside. They learned to just keep going. They learned to manage their emotions internally, often alone. Now, that's not emotional maturity in the healthiest sense, but it certainly looks like maturity from the outside. As adults, this often becomes the habit of handling things quietly, without complaint, even when they're struggling. Modern childhood stretches out. It's padded, protected, and extended. In the 1970s, childhood ended gradually and much earlier. There was no clear moment when someone said, "You're still just a kid." Instead, expectations just increased year by year. You were expected to handle yourself, not bother the adults, solve your own problems, and stay out of trouble. The line between being a kid and being a grown-up was incredibly blurry, so children just stepped across it, often without even noticing. Today, independence is often introduced carefully, step by step. In the 1970s, it was simply assumed. You walked places alone. You made decisions without guidance. You dealt with the consequences without a long explanation. No one asked if you were ready. Readiness was irrelevant. That forces cognitive maturity. Life in the 1970s might have moved slower externally. There was more waiting, more boredom, more silence. But internally, the expectations were heavy, and there was accountability. If you failed, you dealt with it. If you were bored, you had to find a way to entertain yourself. If something broke, you tried to figure it out. This combination of a slow pace with real, tangible expectations matured the mind early. Many kids from that era were also exposed to adult stressors very young: economic uncertainty, divorce, work pressure, social instability. These things weren't explained or contextualized for a child's understanding. Children simply absorbed them. This creates a psychological shift towards hyper-awareness, vigilance, and a certain seriousness. When children are surrounded by adult concerns without the emotional support to process them, they learn to suppress their playfulness and prioritize stability. That looks like growing up fast, because it is. Failure wasn't softened. You didn't get endless second chances. You didn't get constant reassurance or emotional cushioning. Mistakes had weight, and weight changes behavior. Children adapt by becoming more careful, by thinking ahead, and by controlling their impulses. This builds a form of maturity, but it also builds pressure. Many 70s kids became cautious adults not because they were born fearful, but because they learned early on that mistakes were expensive. It was a generation shaped by reality, and it made them who they are today. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights. Back in the 1970s, authority was absolute. You didn't debate the rules. You didn't get lengthy explanations for decisions, and power was certainly not shared. As a kid, you learned very quickly how to navigate authority rather than challenge it. This demanded a surprising level of emotional intelligence at a very young age. You had to read moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust your behavior accordingly. These are complex, adult-level social skills, and learning them so early on dramatically accelerated your psychological age. There was very little encouragement to remain emotionally young. Sure, play existed, but it was almost always unstructured and unsupervised. Fun was something you found, not something that was curated or protected for you. And the moment real responsibilities showed up, play just quietly retreated into the background. Children adapted to this reality by becoming capable, not necessarily joyful, and definitely not carefree, but capable. For 70s kids, this didn't feel like they were stepping up. It just felt like life, because when you looked around, every other kid was doing the exact same thing. There was no other reality to compare it to. So, growing up fast wasn't something that was praised. It was completely invisible. And because it was invisible, it became a permanent part of who they were. For many of us who grew up in that era, adulthood didn't feel like some dramatic, life-altering shift. It actually felt familiar. That's because so many adult traits were already firmly in place: a sense of responsibility, emotional restraint, fierce independence, and a healthy dose of realism. So, becoming an adult didn't shock us. It was simply a continuation of the path we were already on. But growing up this fast has consequences. Many 70s kids today find themselves struggling with things like vulnerability, asking for help, or just slowing down and resting without feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt. Why? Because rest often feels undeserved, dependence feels unsafe, and softness feels completely unfamiliar. We learned how to survive and be tough early on, but many of us never really learned how to relax later in life. Even today, a lot of people from the 70s generation feel psychologically older than their peers from younger generations. We tend to be less reactive, less dramatic, and less surprised by hardship. It's not because we're disconnected or don't care. It's because we've been navigating the world with a sense of adult responsibility for a very, very long time. So, why did this happen? Why did 70s kids grow up faster? It's because responsibility arrived early and unannounced. Our emotional needs were often considered secondary to practical matters. Independence wasn't encouraged, it was just assumed. Mistakes were often costly and came with real consequences. And the unfiltered realities of adult life were always visible, never hidden away. We simply adapted, and that adaptation accelerated our development. The strength that came from this isn't loud or performative. It isn't something we boast about. It's quiet. It shows up in our endurance, in our ability to stay calm under pressure, and in providing stability when everything else is chaos. But it also shows up in a deep, bone-weary fatigue, because carrying adult traits since childhood is a heavy, heavy load. We didn't grow up faster because we wanted to. We grew up faster because the world demanded it of us. And once you adapt to that level of responsibility so early, it becomes a core part of your identity. In today's world, which often works to extend childhood and delay responsibility, 70s kids can feel a bit out of sync. We sometimes have trouble understanding fragility, the need for constant reassurance, or the avoidance of even minor discomfort. It's simply because we never had those options. Growing up fast-forged who we became, grounded, realistic, and emotionally contained people who are incredibly capable under pressure. Not because we were taught these things, but because there was no alternative. As a final thought, 70s kids didn't lose their childhood. They traded a part of it for a lifetime of resilience. We didn't grow up fast to be impressive. We grew up fast because life itself didn't slow down for us. And that early acceleration is exactly what shaped us into who we are today. Strong, capable, and almost always quietly older than the room. Thanks for watching. If this resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.